The bitter Montana wind howled through the gaps in the saloon's wooden walls, carrying with it the promise of another harsh winter. Margaret Rose Sullivan pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she waited tables, trying to ignore the leering eyes of the miners who'd come down from the mountains for supplies. At 19, she'd learned to navigate their crude comments with practiced indifference, though her knuckles turned white as she gripped the serving tray. "Margaret, get yourself over here, girl." Her father's slurred voice cut through the smoky haze. Samuel Sullivan sat at the corner table, cards scattered before him, an empty whiskey bottle at his elbow. The stench of failure and cheap liquor clung to him like a second skin. She approached reluctantly, knowing that look in his bloodshot eyes meant nothing good. The other men at the table, Henderson the banker, old Pete the prospector, and a stranger she didn't recognize, watched her with varying degrees of interest. "Gentlemen," Samuel declared with the false bravado of the desperately drunk. "My beautiful daughter, finest girl in all of Cedar Ridge. Wouldn't you say?" Margaret's stomach churned. When her father started praising her to strange men, it usually meant he was angling for something. She'd seen him try to use her as collateral before, though she'd always managed to talk him out of his worst schemes. "Pa, maybe you should call it a night," she suggested quietly, reaching for his arm. He shook her off violently. "Don't tell me what to do. I'm conducting business here." He turned back to Henderson. $800. That's all I'm asking. I'm good for it. You know I am." Henderson's thin lips curled into a sneer. "Samuel, you haven't been good for anything since your wife passed. God rest her soul." He gathered his winnings and stood. "I'm done extending credit to a man who'd rather drown in a bottle than work an honest day." "Wait." Samuel lurched to his feet, swaying dangerously. "I have collateral." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Pa, no." "The girl," he continued, gesturing wildly at Margaret. "She's young, strong, beautiful, can cook, clean, knows her letters. She'd make any man a fine wife." The saloon seemed to fall silent, though Margaret knew it was just the roaring in her ears drowning out all other sound. Her mother had been dead barely 2 years, taken by fever, and this was what her father had become, a man willing to trade his own daughter like livestock. "You're drunk," she said, her voice trembling with rage and humiliation. "You don't mean that." But Samuel's eyes, despite their glaze, held a terrible determination. $800 to clear my debts, and any man here can have her hand in marriage, legal and proper, before the circuit judge. Old Pete spat tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Nobody here's fool enough to pay $800 for a wife, Sullivan, even one as pretty as your Margaret." "I'll take that wager." The voice came from the shadows near the door, deep, gravelly, like stones grinding together. Every head in the saloon turned as a figure stepped into the lamplight. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Elijah Stone stood 6.5 feet tall, his broad shoulders draped in a buffalo hide coat that had seen better decades. His dark hair hung past his collar, streaked with premature gray, though he couldn't have been more than 35. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, Lord, his eyes were the color of winter sky, piercing and unreadable. The mountain man, the hermit who lived somewhere up in the high country, who came to town maybe twice a year for supplies. Children ran when they saw him coming. Women crossed the street. Men spoke of him in whispers, how he'd fought off a grizzly with nothing but a knife, how he could track a ghost through a blizzard, how he was more wolf than man. Stone. Henderson breathed, taking an involuntary step back. Elijah moved through the crowd like a ship through water. Men simply got out of his way. He reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch, heavy with coin, which he set on the table with a solid thunk. $800, he said simply. Cash money. Samuel's eyes went wide with greed and something else, fear, perhaps, even in his drunken state. He knew what kind of man he was dealing with. But the money was there, real and present, and his debts were crushing him. "Pa, please," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "You can't do this. I'm your daughter." Samuel wouldn't meet her eyes. "It's for your own good. Girl, you need a husband, a home of your own, and Mr. Stone here he's a man of means. He lives like an animal in the mountains." The words burst out of her before she could stop them. The entire saloon held its breath, waiting to see how the mountain man would react to such an insult. But Elijah Stone merely turned those winter eyes on her, studying her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the floorboards. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured. "I live as I choose, Miss Sullivan, away from the lies and pretense of town life." He looked back at Samuel. "Your offer, I accept." "No?" Margaret grabbed her father's arm, tears streaming down her face. "Pa, I'm begging you. I'll work double shifts. I'll take in washing. I'll do anything. Just please don't." "It's done." Samuel snatched up the pouch, clutching it to his chest like salvation itself. "You'll marry him, Margaret, this Sunday. When the circuit judge comes through, it's settled." The room spun around her. This couldn't be happening. Just this morning, she'd been thinking about maybe accepting young Tom Corwin's invitation to the autumn dance. She'd been saving pennies to buy fabric for a new dress. She'd had hopes, modest as they were. And now? She looked at Elijah Stone, searching for some sign of humanity in that weathered face, but he'd already turned away, settling his business with Henderson, who produced paper and ink to draw up the marriage contract. Legal and binding, as her father had said. "Why?" she asked, though she wasn't sure if she was addressing her father or her future husband. "Why would you do this?" Elijah paused at the door, glancing back at her. For just a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in those cold eyes. Sadness, regret. But it was gone before she could be sure. "Sunday," was all he said. Then he was gone, vanishing into the night like the phantom some claimed he was. The saloon erupted in gossip and speculation the moment the door closed behind him. Margaret stood frozen in place, her world collapsing around her. Her father was already at the bar, buying drinks with his blood money, toasting his good fortune. "Tough break. Sweet thing," someone said. She turned to find Tom Corwin at her elbow, his handsome face twisted in an ugly smile. "Could have been me courting you proper, if you'd given me more encouragement. Now you'll be warming the mountain man's bed. Hope he remembers to bathe first." The cruel laughter that followed finally broke through her paralysis. Margaret ran from the saloon, out into the freezing night, her thin shawl offering no protection against the wind that cut through her like accusations. She ran until her lungs burned, until she reached the small cemetery at the edge of town. She fell to her knees beside her mother's grave, her tears freezing on her cheeks. "Mama," she sobbed, pressing her hands against the cold earth. "Mama, what do I do? How could Pa do this to me?" But the dead offered no answers, and the wind only mocked her grief. In 3 days, she would marry a stranger, a man who lived like a wild animal in the mountains, who might be mad or cruel or worse, all because her father valued his comfort more than his daughter's life. As she knelt there in the darkness, Margaret made a vow. She might be forced to marry Elijah Stone, but she would never be his wife in truth. She would find a way to survive, to endure, and someday, somehow, she would be free. The wind howled its agreement, or perhaps its doubt. In the distance, a wolf called to its pack, the sound raising goosebumps on her skin. Soon, that wilderness would be her home, and that terrifying man her husband. Sunday couldn't come fast enough, and yet it loomed before her like an execution date. Margaret Rose Sullivan, who had once dreamed of love and laughter and children raised in warmth and safety, would become Mrs. Elijah Stone, the mountain man's wife. Nobody wanted that fate. Nobody except the man who'd bought it for $800 in gold. The wedding had been a blur of shame and whispered judgments. Margaret barely remembered speaking her vows. Only the weight of the simple iron ring Elijah had placed on her finger and the way the townspeople had stared, some with pity, others with morbid fascination. Now, as the wagon climbed higher into the mountains, leaving Cedar Ridge far behind, the reality of her situation pressed down on her like the gathering storm clouds overhead. She sat as far from her new husband as the wagon bench would allow, her few possessions wrapped in a worn quilt at her feet. Elijah hadn't spoken since they'd left town, his attention focused on navigating the increasingly treacherous path. The only sounds were the creaking of wagon wheels, the snorting of the 2 draft horses, and the wind sighing through the pines. Margaret stole glances at him from beneath her bonnet. In daylight, he seemed even larger than he had in the saloon, his hands sure and steady on the reins despite their size. He'd trimmed his beard for the wedding, she noticed, and his clothes, while still rough, were cleaner than she'd expected. But these small civilized gestures only made him more unsettling, like a wolf wearing a collar. The path grew steeper, winding between massive pines and around granite boulders. Snow still clung to the northern slopes, though it was early autumn in the valley. Margaret pulled her cloak tighter, already feeling the bite of mountain cold through her thin dress. "How much farther?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible above the wind. 2 hours, maybe 3. His voice was as rough as she remembered, but quieter now, almost gentle. "There's buffalo robes behind the seat if you're cold." She wanted to refuse out of pride, but practicality won. The thick fur smelled of smoke and pine needles, surprisingly clean. As she wrapped it around herself, she caught him watching her from the corner of his eye. "Thank you," she said stiffly. He nodded and returned his attention to the path. The cabin appeared just as the first fat snowflakes began to fall. Margaret had expected something crude, perhaps a lean-to or a dugout carved into the hillside. Instead, she saw a proper log structure, modest but well-built, with a stone chimney already sending up smoke. A smaller building that must be a barn stood nearby, and what looked like a root cellar was built into the hillside. Elijah brought the wagon to a stop before the cabin door. He climbed down and came around to her side, offering his hand. Margaret hesitated, then accepted his help, trying not to notice how her hand disappeared in his or how easily he lifted her down. "I'll see to the horses," he said. "Go on inside. Fire's been burning since yesterday, so it should be warm." Margaret stood uncertainly by the wagon. "Where should I put my things?" Something flickered across his face. "Surprise, perhaps. Wherever you like. It's your home now." "Your home?" The word sat strangely in her chest as she gathered her meager bundle and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The interior stopped her cold. She'd expected darkness, dirt, the chaos of a man living alone. Instead, lamplight revealed a space that was simple but clean, even comfortable. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with more books than she'd expected to see outside a schoolhouse. A bearskin rug covered the plank floor before the hearth. Through an open doorway, she glimpsed what must be a bedroom. Everything was handmade, but crafted with evident care. The furniture solid and smooth-sanded, iron hooks forged with decorative twists, even curtains at the windows made from what looked like trading post calico. It was the home of someone who valued comfort and beauty, even in isolation. On the table sat a covered pot that smelled of stew, still warm, and a loaf of fresh bread wrapped in cloth. He'd prepared for her arrival, she realized, had cleaned and cooked and made ready. The unexpected thoughtfulness left her off balance. The door opened, bringing a swirl of snow and cold. Elijah entered, stamping his boots on the threshold. He seemed to fill the room, making the space suddenly smaller. "Storm's picking up," he said, hanging his coat on a peg. "Might be snowed in for a few days." Margaret's chest tightened at the thought of being trapped here with this stranger. "I see." An awkward silence stretched between them. "Finally." Elijah gestured to the table. "You should eat. Been a long day." She was hungry, she realized, having been too nervous to eat that morning. She sat carefully at the table while he ladled stew into wooden bowls venison with vegetables she recognized from her mother's garden potatoes. Carrots, onions. It was well seasoned, better than she'd expected. "You cook," she said, surprise making her forget her determination to remain silent. "Man has to eat." He sat across from her, the chair creaking under his weight. "Been doing for myself since I was 15. She wanted to ask why, what had driven a 15-year-old boy into these mountains, but held her tongue. They ate in silence while the storm gathered strength outside, wind rattling the windows. When they'd finished, Margaret rose to clear the dishes, needing something to do with her hands. Elijah watched her move about the kitchen area, finding things by instinct. Water bucket by the door, dish basin on a shelf, soap wrapped in paper. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I'm your wife," she replied, the words bitter in her mouth. "Isn't this what you bought me for, to cook and clean?" His face darkened, and she immediately regretted her sharp tongue. But he only stood and moved to a chest in the corner, pulling out folded blankets and another buffalo robe. "Bedroom's through there," he said, nodding to the doorway. "You'll find everything you need. I'll sleep out here by the fire." Margaret blinked. "You're not—" She couldn't finish the question, heat rising to her cheeks. "I'm not." His voice was firm. "That's your room now. Bar the door if it makes you feel safer." She stood frozen, dishes forgotten in her hands. This wasn't what she'd expected, what she'd steeled herself for during the long ride up the mountain. "I don't understand." Elijah was already arranging his makeshift bed by the hearth, his back to her. "Get some sleep. Margaret, tomorrow will come soon enough." Confused and wary, she finished the dishes and gathered her bundle. The bedroom was small but clean, with a proper bed covered in a quilt that looked store-bought, a washstand with pitcher and bowl, and another shelf of books. A small window looked out into swirling white. There was a bar for the door, as he'd said. After a moment's hesitation, she dropped it into place. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, trying to make sense of this strange turn. She'd prepared herself for brutality, for demands, for all the horrors her imagination had conjured. Instead, she'd found a clean home, a hot meal, and a husband who apparently intended to sleep on his own floor rather than claim what law and custom said was his right. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing, and she could hear the crackle of the fire in the main room. Exhaustion eventually won over confusion. She lay down fully clothed on top of the covers, ready to spring up at any sound. But the only sounds were the storm and the settling of logs in the fire. Once, she thought she heard him moving about, and then the soft sound of pages turning. He was reading. She realized. The mountain man, the savage everyone feared, was spending his wedding night reading by the fire while his bride slept unmolested in his bed. When she woke, pale morning light filtered through the window. The storm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in white. She could smell coffee and something else, bacon cautiously. She lifted the bar and peered out. Elijah sat at the table, a book open before him, cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up at her entrance, and she was struck again by those winter sky eyes. "Morning," he said simply. "Coffee's hot. Breakfast in the pan if you're hungry." She emerged slowly, aware of her wrinkled dress and disheveled hair. "You're reading Shakespeare," she said, recognizing the book. "Winters are long up here." He closed the book, stood. "I need to check the livestock, see what the storm did. There's water heated for washing. Whatever else you need, just look around or ask." He pulled on his coat and was gone before she could form a response. Margaret stood in the middle of the cabin that was now apparently her home, trying to reconcile everything she'd thought she knew with what she was discovering. On the table where he'd been sitting, she noticed something that hadn't been there the night before. A small wooden carving of a bird, a sparrow, delicately made, no bigger than her thumb. She picked it up, running her fingers over the smooth wings, the carefully detailed feathers. Through the window, she could see him trudging through the snow toward the barn, a solitary figure in a white world. Nobody wanted to be the mountain man's wife. She'd told herself, but perhaps she needed to learn who the mountain man truly was before she decided what she wanted at all. The sparrow was surprisingly warm in her hand, as if it had absorbed some human warmth from its maker. She set it carefully on the shelf with her few possessions and went to pour herself coffee, wondering what other surprises this strange new life might hold. The blizzard struck 3 weeks into their strange marriage, trapping them in the cabin for 6 days straight. By the 3rd day, Margaret thought she might go mad from the silence. Elijah could go hours without speaking, apparently content with his books and his whittling, while she paced the small space like a caged animal. She'd already cleaned everything twice, reorganized the shelves, and mended every piece of clothing that showed the slightest wear. Now she stood at the frosted window, watching the white wall of snow that made the world beyond invisible. "You'll wear a groove in the floor," Elijah said from his chair by the fire. It was the first thing he'd said all morning. Margaret turned, surprised to find him watching her with something that might have been amusement. "I'm not used to being idle," she said defensively. "Neither am I." He set down the piece of wood he'd been carving. "But fighting the weather is like fighting the mountains themselves. Waste of energy." "Easy for you to say. You chose this life." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. They'd maintained a careful politeness these past weeks. Him sleeping by the fire, her in the bedroom, sharing meals but little else. But the storm had worn her patience thin. His expression didn't change. "That's true enough." He stood, stretching muscles cramped from sitting. "You play cards?" The question was so unexpected she almost laughed. "Cards. Unless you'd prefer to keep wearing out my floorboards." Despite herself, Margaret felt her lips twitch. "My mother taught me whist." "Then we'll play whist." He retrieved a worn deck from a drawer. "Though I should warn you, I've been known to cheat." "A mountain man who reads Shakespeare and cheats at cards," she murmured, taking a seat across from him. What would the good people of Cedar Ridge think? Nothing they don't already think, I imagine. He dealt the cards with practiced hands. "My reputation was set long before you arrived." As they played, the tension in the room eased slightly. Elijah was indeed a shameless cheat, though he made no effort to hide it, slipping cards from his sleeve with exaggerated movements that made her laugh despite herself. "You're terrible at this," she told him after catching him red-handed for the 3rd time. "At cheating, I thought I was doing rather well. At hiding it, what's the point of cheating if everyone can see you doing it?" He considered this gravely. Entertainment value. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. They played until the cards were too familiar. Then Elijah brought out a chess set carved from dark and light wood. "Do you know the game?" "A little. My mother—" Margaret's voice caught. It still hurt to speak of her. "She believed girls should be educated same as boys." Smart woman. He set up the pieces with careful precision. My mother felt the same. Said ignorance was the only true sin. It was the first time he'd mentioned his family. Margaret moved a pawn, watching him from under her lashes. "Where is she now?" "Dead. Cholera took her when I was 12. His voice was matter-of-fact, but his hand hesitated over his knight. "Father followed 2 years later. Grief, the doctor said, though I think it was more like he just decided not to wake up one morning." "I'm sorry." He shrugged. "Long time ago." He made his move, then looked at her directly. "What happened to your mother?" "Fever. 2 winters past." Margaret captured his pawn, trying to match his emotional distance. "She held on as long as she could. I think, knew what would happen to me with just Pa." And what did happen? The question hung between them like the snow hanging in the air outside. Margaret met his steady gaze. You know what happened. You were there. I was there for the end, not the beginning. She laughed bitterly. The beginning which part? When Pa started drinking away our savings. When he began gambling with money we didn't have. When he looked at me and saw not a daughter but a commodity to be traded. Her voice broke on the last word. Elijah reached across the board, his large hand covering hers briefly before withdrawing. You're not a commodity, Margaret. You're a person, a smart, capable person who deserves better than what you've been given. Then why? The question burst out of her. Why did you buy me if you don't want, if you sleep on the floor and barely speak to me? Why pay $800 for a wife you don't even want? Elijah was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, careful. You ever see what happens to a rabbit caught in a snare? The more it struggles, the tighter the wire gets. Sometimes the kindest thing is to cut the wire, even if the rabbit runs away after. So I'm a rabbit now. You're someone who was trapped. The marriage was the only wire I could cut. Margaret stared at him. You paid $800 to set me free. That makes no sense. Makes perfect sense to me. He moved his queen. Your move. They played in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. When the wind howled particularly fierce, Elijah would add another log to the fire. When Margaret shivered despite the warmth, he wordlessly handed her a blanket. As the evening deepened, he set aside the chessboard and picked up a book. Would you like me to read aloud? She nodded, curling into her chair with the blanket wrapped around her. His voice, she discovered, changed when he read. The roughness smoothed out, and he gave each character a different tone. It was Shakespeare again. Much Ado About Nothing, and she found herself laughing at the war between Beatrice and Benedict. You've done this before, she said during a pause. Read aloud. I mean, used to read to the men in the logging camps, before I came up here. He marked his place with a finger. Gets lonesome in the woods. A book and a voice can make all the difference. Why did you leave? He was quiet again, considering. Got tired of watching trees that had stood for centuries fall in minutes. Tired of the waste, the greed. One day I looked around and realized I'd become part of something I hated. So I walked away. Just like that. Just like that. He reopened the book. Shall I continue? She nodded, but her mind was turning over this new information. A logger who'd quit rather than continue destroying what he'd come to value. A man who'd spent $800 to free a trapped woman, who read Shakespeare by firelight and carved delicate birds from scraps of wood. The next morning, the storm had begun to weaken. Elijah ventured out to check on the animals, returning covered in snow but triumphant with fresh eggs from the henhouse he'd built into the side of the barn. Your chickens survived. Margaret was amazed. Takes more than a blizzard to kill mountain chickens, he said, stamping snow from his boots. Though they're decidedly unhappy about the whole situation. As she cooked the eggs, she found herself humming, something she hadn't done since her mother died. Elijah was back at the table, working on a new carving. She could see it taking shape. A wolf, this time, caught mid-howl. You could sell those, she said, setting his plate before him. Your carvings. They're beautiful. He looked up, surprised. You think so? I know so. That sparrow you left for me. She hesitated, then pressed on. Why a sparrow? Seemed fitting. He attacked his eggs with appetite. Small bird, but fierce. Survives winters that kill larger creatures. Builds its home anywhere. Makes the best of what it's given. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm not fierce. No. He gestured around the cabin. You've been here 3 weeks, reorganized my entire kitchen, improved my cooking, beaten me at chess twice, and somehow made this place feel more like a home than it's felt in years. If that's not fierce, I don't know what is. She didn't know what to say to that, so she busied herself with her own breakfast. But inside, something warm unfurled in her chest, a feeling she'd thought had died with her mother. That night, as Elijah settled onto his makeshift bed by the fire, Margaret paused in the doorway to the bedroom. Elijah, he looked up, firelight playing across his features. Thank you for the sparrow, for everything. He nodded slowly. You're welcome, Margaret. She almost said more, almost suggested he didn't need to sleep on the floor, that the cabin was his home more than hers, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she retreated to the bedroom, leaving the door unbarred for the first time. Small steps, she thought, like a sparrow building its nest one twig at a time. Whatever this strange marriage was becoming, it was something neither of them had expected. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what they both needed. The nightmare came in the depths of winter's worst storm. Margaret woke gasping, her mother's fevered face still vivid behind her eyelids, her father's drunken voice echoing in her ears. She sat up, disoriented, heart racing in the darkness. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and making the cabin creak. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders, trying to slow her breathing, but the dream clung to her like cobwebs. In it, she'd been back in Cedar Ridge, standing in the saloon while her father auctioned her off to the highest bidder. But this time, the men bidding weren't human. They had wolves' eyes and bear's teeth, and they fought over her while she stood frozen, unable to run or scream. A soft knock at her door made her jump. Margaret. Elijah's voice was quiet, concerned. Are you all right, I heard? She realized she must have cried out in her sleep. Embarrassment flooded through her, but the dream's terror still held her tight. I'm fine, she managed, though her voice shook. There was a pause. Then, would you like some tea? Sometimes it helps. The unexpected kindness undid her. A sob escaped before she could stop it, and suddenly she was crying, really crying, for the first time since her wedding day. All the fear and anger and grief she'd been holding back poured out in the darkness. She heard the door open, felt rather than saw Elijah enter. He didn't speak, didn't try to touch her. He simply sat on the floor beside the bed, his presence solid and patient as a mountain. I'm sorry, she gasped between sobs. I don't know why Nothing to apologize for, he said quietly. Sometimes the heart needs to empty itself of old pain to make room for something new. She cried until she had no tears left. While the storm raged outside and Elijah sat silent guard beside her, when the sobs finally subsided to hiccups, he rose and returned with a cup of hot tea that smelled of mint and honey. My mother's recipe, he said, pressing the warm cup into her hands. Said it could cure anything from nightmares to broken hearts. Margaret sipped the tea, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. Did it work? Sometimes. He settled back on the floor, leaning against the wall. Other times, she'd tell stories until the hurt got smaller. What kind of stories? In the darkness, she could hear the smile in his voice. Oh, all kinds, about the stars. Mostly, she was partial to the constellation stories. Said the best thing about them was that no matter how lost you got, you could look up and find your way home. Tell me one, Margaret whispered. Please. So he did. His voice, deep and steady, wove through the darkness as he told her about Cassiopeia. The vain queen turned into stars, forced to circle the sky forever. Then Perseus and Andromeda, the hero and the maiden. As he spoke, the storm seemed to quiet. Or perhaps it was just that his voice made everything else fade away. There's another story, he said after a pause. Not about stars, but about sunrise. Want to hear it? She nodded, then realized he couldn't see her in the dark. Yes. There's a place up on the ridge Eagle's Peak. The Blackfoot call it. Takes about an hour to climb in good weather. From the top, you can see the whole valley spread out like a map. But the real magic is sunrise. His voice took on a distant quality, as if he was seeing it in his mind. The sun comes up over the eastern mountains, and for just a few minutes, everything turns gold. The snow, the trees, even the air itself, like the whole world's been dipped in honey. Margaret found herself leaning forward, caught by the picture he painted. "You've seen it?" "Many times. First time was right after I came up here, when I was still angry at everything. Couldn't sleep, so I climbed in the dark, figuring I'd watch the sun come up and then decide whether to stay or go back to the world." He shifted slightly. "Then I saw it, that golden light spreading across creation, and I knew I was home." "It sounds beautiful." "It is peaceful, too, like God's own hand smoothing away all the rough edges of the world." He was quiet for a moment. "I could show you when the weather clears, if you'd like." Margaret's breath caught. In all their weeks of careful coexistence, he'd never offered to share something so personal. "I'd like that," she said softly. They sat in companionable silence after that, the storm gradually weakening outside. Margaret finished her tea, feeling calmer than she had in months, perhaps years. "Elijah," she said finally. Why do you sleep on the floor?" She felt him tense slightly, though his voice remained even. "You know why." "Tell me anyway." He sighed. "Because you didn't choose this. Didn't choose me. Man's got no right to take what isn't freely given." "And if it was," the question slipped out before she could stop it. "Freely given, I mean." The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with some deep emotion. "Then I'd count myself the luckiest man in these mountains. But that's not something that can be forced or rushed. Trust grows like trees, slowly, with deep roots." Margaret set down her empty cup, gathering courage. "Stay," she said quietly. Not like that. Just stay. The floor's cold, and the bed's big enough, and I don't want to be alone tonight." She heard his sharp intake of breath. "Margaret, please." She pulled back the quilts on the far side of the bed. "I trust you." Moving slowly, as if afraid to spook her, Elijah rose and settled on the very edge of the bed, still fully clothed. The mattress dipped under his weight, but he kept careful distance between them. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me as a person, not a commodity or a possession or a duty, just a person." His hand found hers in the darkness, enfolding it gently. "You're more than that. Margaret Stone. Much more." It was the first time he'd used her married name, and something about it, the way he said it, like it meant something, like it mattered, made her throat tight with emotion. "Tell me more about the sunrise," she said. "Tell me about all the beautiful things you've seen up here." So he did, his voice weaving pictures of mountain meadows full of wildflowers, of eagles soaring on thermals, of nights so clear you could see stars most folks never dreamed existed, somewhere in the middle of a story about a family of foxes that denned near his cabin one spring. Margaret drifted off to sleep, her hand still held safely in his. She woke to pale morning light and the smell of coffee. The storm had passed, leaving the world crystalline and new. Elijah was gone, but the warmth of where he'd lain beside her remained, along with something else on the pillow. A new carving. It was a tiny sun, no bigger than a coin, with delicate rays spreading outward. When she held it up to the window, the light seemed to flow through the thin parts of the wood, making it glow like the sunrise he'd described. She found him at the stove, cooking breakfast as if nothing had changed. But when he turned to greet her, she saw something new in his winter sky eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Good morning," he said simply. "Good morning." She held up the carving. "It's beautiful." "Figured you should have your own sunrise, for the dark days." He turned back to the stove, but she saw the tips of his ears redden slightly. They ate breakfast in comfortable quiet. The silence between them no longer a wall, but a bridge. When Elijah mentioned checking his trap lines, Margaret surprised herself by asking, "Could I come with you?" He looked at her carefully. "It's hard walking in the snow, and cold. I'm tougher than I look, Sparrow. Remember?" That earned her one of his rare smiles, a real one that transformed his weathered face. "All right then, Sparrow, let's see if you can fly." As she bundled into borrowed furs and followed him into the glittering white world, Margaret realized something had fundamentally shifted in the night. The marriage that had begun as a cage had become something else. Not quite love. Not yet, but the possibility of it, like seeds waiting under snow for spring to come. She thought of the title phrase that had haunted her. Nobody wanted to be the mountain man's wife, but watching Elijah move through his beloved wilderness, seeing how he read the land like others read books, remembering his gentle patience in the dark hours of the night. She wondered if perhaps everyone had been wrong. Perhaps being the mountain man's wife meant something entirely different than what the gossips of Cedar Ridge imagined. Perhaps it meant being seen, being valued, being held safe in the storm. Perhaps it meant being free. The riders came with a spring thaw. When patches of brown earth began showing through the melting snow, Margaret saw them first from the window, 5 men on horseback, picking their way up the mountain path. Her blood ran cold when she recognized the lead rider's golden hair catching the afternoon sun. "Elijah," she called, her voice tight. "We have company." He was at her side in an instant, peering through the window. His expression darkened. "Tom Corwin." "You know him?" "Know of him. His father owns the biggest ranch in the valley. The boy fancies himself important because of it." Elijah moved to the mantel, checking his rifle. "Stay inside." "No." Margaret surprised herself with the firmness of her refusal. "Whatever he wants, I won't hide like I've done something wrong." Elijah looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Your choice, but stay close." They stepped out together as the riders entered the clearing. Tom Corwin had grown a mustache since she'd last seen him, probably thinking it made him look older than his 23 years. His companions were ranch hands by the look of them, hard men with harder eyes. "Well, well," Tom drawled, not bothering to dismount. "Mrs. Stone, don't you look rustic?" Margaret felt Elijah tense beside her, but kept her own voice steady. "Mr. Corwin, what brings you all this way?" "Concern for an old friend." His smile was all teeth, no warmth. "The whole town's been worried about you, Margaret, wondering what kind of life you're living up here with." He looked Elijah up and down with obvious distaste. Him. "As you can see, I'm perfectly well." "Are you?" Tom leaned forward in his saddle. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you're being held prisoner by a man who's more beast than human, living in squalor, cut off from civilization, probably against your will." "That's enough," Elijah said quietly. Tom's eyes glittered dangerously. "I wasn't talking to you, mountain man. In fact, I'm not convinced you can talk at all. Everyone knows you're touched in the head, living up here alone all these years. Talking to wolves, they say, practicing dark rituals." One of the ranch hands shifted nervously. "Tom, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Carl." Tom's attention never left Margaret. "I've come to make you an offer. Margaret, come back with us. We'll have the marriage annulled. Everyone knows it wasn't valid. You being forced and all. You can stay at the ranch until you get back on your feet." "And what would be the price of such generosity?" Margaret asked, though she already knew. Tom's smile widened. "Why?" "Gratitude. Of course. A woman in your position should be grateful for protection. Very grateful." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt sick, remembering all the times Tom had cornered her in town. His hands always reaching, his words always suggesting. She'd thought marriage to Elijah was the worst fate possible. But now— "Thank you for your concern," she said carefully. But I'm content where I am." "Content?" Tom laughed, ugly and sharp. "With this animal look at you. Margaret, your dress is patched, your hands are rough, you're wasting away up here when you could be living properly, like a real lady." "She is a lady," Elijah said, his voice carrying an edge Margaret had never heard before. "More of one than you'll ever deserve to know." Tom's face flushed red. "How dare you speak to me, you filthy—" "Choose your next words carefully." Elijah stepped forward slightly, and suddenly the very air seemed to change. The horses shifted uneasily, and even Tom's men looked nervous. "You're on my land, insulting my wife. I've been patient, but patience has limits." "Is that a threat?" "It's information." For a moment, violence hung in the balance. Then Tom seemed to remember he was outnumbered by the very mountains themselves. He gathered his reins, but his eyes stayed on Margaret. "This isn't over. When you come to your senses, and you will remember my offer." He looked at Elijah with pure hatred. "And you, mountain man, you can't keep her here forever. One day she'll see what you really are, a savage playing at being civilized. And when that day comes—" He didn't finish the threat, wheeling his horse around. But as the group rode away, one of the men looked back, and Margaret saw him make a sign against evil. They stood in silence until the riders disappeared into the trees. Then Margaret's knees gave out, and she would have fallen if Elijah hadn't caught her. "Easy," he murmured, guiding her to sit on the porch step. "They're gone." "They'll be back," she said, her voice shaking. "Tom doesn't like being refused, and now he'll spread stories, say I'm bewitched or worse." "Let him talk." Elijah sat beside her, careful not to touch. "Words can't hurt what's true." "Can't they?" She laughed bitterly. "Words are all it took to paint you as a monster, to make everyone fear you." "I never cared what they thought." "I care." The admission surprised her. "I care that they think you're savage when you read Shakespeare. I care that they call you an animal when you're gentler than any man I've known. I care that they say you're touched when you're the sanest person in these mountains." Elijah was quiet for a long moment. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why do you care what they think of me?" Margaret turned to look at him, really look at him. The afternoon sun caught in his eyes, turning them the color of winter sky breaking into spring. She thought of all the small kindnesses, the patient silences, the way he'd held her hand in the darkness. "Because," she said slowly, "somewhere between that first night and now, you became important to me." Something shifted in his expression, vulnerable and wondering. "Margaret!" "I know what they see when they look at you," she continued, needing to say it all. "But I see the man who carves beauty from dead wood, who reads stories to chase away nightmares, who bought my freedom and asked nothing in return." She took a breath. "I see my husband, and I'm not ashamed of that, not anymore." Elijah's hand found hers, his fingers trembling slightly. "You humble me," he said roughly. "I never expected, never hoped—" "What, that someone might see past the stories? That someone might see me at all?" The raw honesty in his voice broke her heart. Without thinking, she reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his beard, the warmth of his skin. "I see you, Elijah Stone, all of you." He caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. The possibility hung between them, fragile as spring ice. Then a wolf howled in the distance, breaking the spell. "We should go inside," Elijah said, though he didn't release her hand. "They might circle back." But as they rose, Margaret saw movement at the edge of the clearing. Not horses, wolves, a full pack, arranged in a loose semicircle, watching with intelligent eyes. The lead wolf, massive and gray, looked directly at them before melting back into the forest. "Friends of yours?" Margaret asked, only half joking. Sometimes the mountain provides its own protection, Elijah said mysteriously. That night, as they prepared dinner together, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Tom's threats. What if he comes back with more men? What if he brings the sheriff? Then we'll deal with it. Elijah handed her plates to set on the table. But I don't think he will. Tom Corwin is a coward at heart. Cowards prefer to work in shadows. You sound like you've dealt with his type before. Too many times. He ladled stew into bowls. Men who think power comes from taking instead of building, who see strength as the ability to hurt rather than heal. They ate in companionable silence, but Margaret could feel the day's tension still humming between them. Finally, she set down her spoon. I meant what I said, about seeing you, about not being ashamed. Elijah looked up at her. I know you did. That's what terrifies me. Why? Because now I have something to lose. His voice was quiet, intense. Before you came, I had my mountains, my solitude, my simple life. I was content. But now I wake up looking forward to your smile. I catch myself listening for your footsteps, saving interesting passages to read to you, carving things just to see your eyes light up. He shook his head. You've disturbed my peace. Margaret Stone, thoroughly and completely. Heat rose to her cheeks. I'm not sorry. Neither am I, and that's the most terrifying part of all. Later, as night fell and they settled by the fire, Elijah with his carving, Margaret with her mending, she found herself watching him work. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy, coaxing form from formlessness. What are you making now? He held up the piece, a wolf, head thrown back in a howl, so lifelike she could almost hear its voice. For the baby, he said, when it comes. Margaret's needle slipped, pricking her finger. What baby? He looked at her with those steady eyes. The one you'll have someday. Our children should know the mountains protect them, just like they protected us today. Our children. The word sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. She thought of Tom's threats, of the town's whispers, of all the forces that would try to tear them apart. But she also thought of wolves standing guard, of sunrise over Eagle's Peak, of a man who spoke of their future with quiet certainty. Yes, she said softly, returning to her mending with steady hands. They should know that. Outside, as if in agreement, the wolf pack took up their howling, not a threat, but a promise. The mountains would remember who belonged and who didn't, and those who belonged would always be protected. The nightmare came true on a moonless night 2 weeks later. Margaret woke to the sound of horses and rough voices, then the sharp crack of gunfire. Before she could fully comprehend what was happening, men burst through the door, not Tom Corwin's ranch hands, but strangers with cruel faces and crueler intentions. There she is, one shouted. The witch! Hands grabbed her, dragging her from the bed. She fought, screaming for Elijah, but he was nowhere to be seen. They bound her wrists with rope that bit into her skin, stuffed a gag in her mouth when she wouldn't stop shouting. Where's the mountain man? The apparent leader demanded, a scarred man with dead eyes. Probably ran off. Another laughed. Even savages know when they're outnumbered. But Margaret knew better. Elijah would never abandon her. If he wasn't here, something had happened to him. Fear colder than mountain winter filled her chest. They threw her over a saddle like a sack of grain, and the world became a blur of darkness and pain as they rode hard down the mountain. She caught glimpses of torches, heard mentions of trial and cleansing, and understood with growing horror what Tom Corwin had done. He'd spread his poison well, turning her refusal into something sinister, painting her as a witch who'd enchanted the mountain man. The old mining camp outside Cedar Ridge had been abandoned for years, but tonight it blazed with torchlight. A crowd had gathered, faces she recognized twisted with mob fervor. Tom Corwin stood at the center, playing righteous leader. "Citizens of Cedar Ridge," he called as they dragged Margaret from the horse. "We've rescued this poor woman from the creature that held her captive, but we must determine if she's been corrupted by his dark influence." "This is madness!" Margaret tried to shout through the gag, but only muffled sounds emerged. "She speaks in tongues," someone cried. "The devil's language." They tied her to a post in the center of the camp, the ropes cutting off circulation. Tom approached, his expression a mockery of concern. "Remove her gag," he ordered. When someone protested about spells, he smiled coldly. "I'm not afraid of a confused woman's words." The moment the gag came free, Margaret spat at his feet. "You're the only devil here, Tom Corwin. This is about your bruised pride, nothing more." "See how she's changed," Tom addressed the crowd. "The sweet Margaret Sullivan we knew would never speak so. She's been corrupted, body and soul, by that creature. We must save her." "Save me!" Margaret laughed bitterly. "You mean own me? That's what this has always been about. You can't stand that I chose him over you." Tom's face darkened. He leaned close, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You could have been mine willingly. Now you'll learn what happens to women who forget their place." "My place is with my husband," she said clearly, loudly. "Elijah Stone is 10 times the man you'll ever be." The blow came fast, snapping her head to the side. Blood filled her mouth, but she kept her eyes steady on his. "Confess," Tom said, playing to the crowd again. "Confess that he bewitched you, forced you into unholy acts. Confess, and we'll show mercy." "I confess nothing but the truth, that I love him." The words rang out clear and strong, silencing the crowd for a moment. Margaret hadn't meant to say them, hadn't even fully realized they were true until they left her lips. But there it was. She loved the quiet mountain man who carved beauty from wood and read Shakespeare by firelight. "Love," Tom sneered. "You call it love when he keeps you prisoner when he speaks to wolves and practices dark arts. He speaks to wolves because he understands wildness better than you understand civilization. He practices nothing darker than kindness, something foreign to you." Another blow, harder this time. Stars exploded across her vision. "Enough talk," someone in the crowd called. "If she's a witch, let God judge her trial by water." The cry took up quickly, mob mentality overriding reason. They began dragging wood for a pyre near the old mine's water tank. If she drowned, she was innocent. If she floated, she was a witch to be burned. Medieval madness in modern times. That's when the howling started. Low at first, just one voice on the wind. Then another joined, and another, until the night filled with wild song. The horses began to panic, fighting their tethers. The crowd pressed together, suddenly remembering they were far from town, surrounded by wilderness. "Just wolves," Tom said. But his voice cracked. "Keep building the pyre." The wolves appeared like ghosts from shadow, dozens of them, more than anyone had seen in these parts. They formed a circle around the camp, eyes glowing in the torchlight. At their head stood the great gray Margaret had seen before, magnificent and terrible. Then, from the darkness beyond the wolves, came a voice that froze everyone in place. "Let her go!" Elijah emerged from the night like something out of legend. Blood ran from a gash on his temple, and his clothes were torn. They'd ambushed him, Margaret realized, but hadn't succeeded in keeping him down. He carried his rifle, but it was the look in his eyes that made grown men step backward. "The mountain man!" someone screamed. "He commands the wolves!" "I command nothing," Elijah said, never taking his eyes off Tom. "But the mountain knows its own, and it doesn't like what it sees here tonight." "You're outnumbered," Tom said, though his hand shook as he drew his pistol. 1 man against 20. 1 man. Elijah smiled, cold as winter wind. "Look around you. Corwin, do I look alone?" As if on cue, the wolves stepped closer, their circle tightening. Someone fired a shot in panic, and chaos erupted. The wolves didn't attack, they didn't need to. Their presence alone sent the mob into terrified flight. Horses broke free, men ran, torches fell and scattered. Tom tried to stand his ground, pistol aimed at Elijah. "I'll kill you, monster! Then we'll see how brave she is." He never saw the gray wolf until it was on him. The massive creature hit him from the side, sending the gun flying. Tom screamed as he went down, the wolf's jaws closing on his gun arm, not killing, just holding, while those ancient eyes stared into his. "Call him off!" Tom sobbed. "Please?" Elijah walked past him as if he didn't exist, going straight to Margaret. His hands were gentle as he cut her bonds, catching her as she sagged forward. "I'm here," he murmured against her hair. "I've got you. You're safe." "I knew you'd come," she whispered, then louder. "Fierce, I told them you'd come." The gray wolf released Tom, who scrambled backward, cradling his mangled arm. The other wolves began melting back into the forest, their work done. "This isn't over," Tom gasped. "I'll bring the real law. Federal marshals. Army if I have to. Everyone will know what you are." Elijah looked at him with something almost like pity. "What I am," he said quietly, "is a man who loves his wife. What you are is a coward who needs a mob to fight his battles." He gathered Margaret in his arms, lifting her as easily as a child. "If you come to my mountain again, Tom Corwin, you'd better bring an army, because the wolves will be waiting. And next time, I won't ask them to be gentle." He walked away into the darkness, leaving Tom bleeding in the dirt. The remaining mob members had fled, and the abandoned camp fell silent except for Tom's whimpers. Margaret buried her face against Elijah's chest, breathing in his familiar scent of pine and wood smoke. "How did you find me? How did the wolves know?" "The mountain has its ways," he said simply, "and I would have torn it apart stone by stone to find you." "I meant it," she said as they climbed toward home, the wolves shadowing their path. "What I said back there, I love you, Elijah Stone." His arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Margaret Stone, have since the moment you stood up in that saloon and called me an animal." She laughed despite everything, the sound startling in the darkness. "That's when you fell in love, when I insulted you." "That's when I knew you were different. Everyone else was afraid. You were furious, magnificent in your fury." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "My fierce little sparrow." By the time they reached the cabin, dawn was breaking. The wolves had vanished with the night, leaving only tracks in the frost. Elijah tended her injuries with gentle hands, washing away blood and applying salve to rope burns. "They'll be back," Margaret said quietly. "Tom won't let this go." "Maybe," Elijah agreed. "But I don't think so. Cowards like him prefer victims who can't fight back. He learned tonight that you're not a victim, that you have protection he can't understand or overcome. The wolves, not just the wolves." He cupped her face in his hands. "You have me. You have these mountains. You have the strength that comes from choosing your own path." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "You're not trapped anymore. Margaret, you're free, free to stay, free to go, free to be exactly who you are." "Then I choose to stay," she said firmly. "I choose you. I choose us." This time, when he leaned in, she met him halfway. The kiss was gentle, careful of her split lip, but it held promises of passion to come. When they pulled apart, Margaret saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "No more sleeping on the floor," she said. "No more sleeping on the floor." He agreed. Outside, the sun crested the peaks, painting the world in gold. Somewhere in the forest, a wolf howled, not a threat but a celebration. The mountain man's wife was home, where she belonged, where she was loved, where she was free. Summer arrived gently in the mountains, painting wildflowers across meadows and filling the air with bird song. Margaret stood in the garden she'd coaxed from the rocky soil, her hands deep in earth. planting seeds Elijah had traded for in town. The sun warmed her shoulders through her simple dress, one she'd made herself from fabric he'd brought her, insisting she needed nothing from her old life. "Carrots here," she murmured to herself, "and beans along the fence where they can climb." Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into Elijah's embrace. This easy affection had grown between them in the months since that terrible night, a natural progression from friendship to partnership to something deeper than either had imagined possible. "You're talking to the plants now," he observed, his beard tickling her ear. "Should I be worried?" Says the man who has entire conversations with wolves. "That's different. They talk back." She turned in his arms, smiling up at him. "And what do they say?" "Usually bring more venison. These rabbits are too small." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering. "Today they asked when you're going to have that baby." Margaret laughed. "The wolves are getting presumptuous." "Or observant." Her breath caught at the knowing look in his eyes. She had been planning to tell him that evening, had practiced the words, but trust Elijah to already know. The man who could track a deer through a blizzard had surely noticed the changes in her body, her morning queasiness, the new fullness to her figure. "How long have you known?" "About 3 weeks." He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Been waiting for you to be ready to say it." Tears pricked her eyes. "I wanted to be sure, after Mama lost 2 between me and—" She swallowed hard. "I wanted to be sure." "And are you sure?" "As sure as these mountains." She covered his hand with hers. "Winter baby. January. Maybe February." His face transformed with joy so pure it took her breath away. Then worry creased his brow. "We'll need to get you to town for a doctor." "No." Her voice came out sharper than intended. "No town. No doctor. The midwife from the Blackfoot camp said she'd come when it's time." "Margaret." "I won't go back there, Elijah. Not after what they did, what they tried to do." She gripped his hands. "This baby will be born here, in our home, surrounded by love instead of judgment." He studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right, but we prepare. Extra supplies, medicines, everything we might need. I won't risk you." "You won't lose me." She reached up to touch his face. "I'm too stubborn to die." "That you are, Sparrow. That you are." They worked side by side through the summer days, expanding the garden, preserving food, preparing the cabin for a new life. Elijah carved a cradle from pine, sanding it smooth as silk, while Margaret sewed tiny clothes from the soft fabrics he brought from his trading trips. On one such evening, as she worked by lamplight, she asked, "Do you ever regret it, this life? So far from everything." He looked up from the toy horse he was carving. "Do you mean, do I regret saving you from Tom Corwin and his mob?" "I mean, do you regret the isolation it brings? We can't go to town without stares and whispers. Any children we have will grow up apart from others." "They'll grow up free," he corrected gently. "They'll know these mountains like their own hearts. They'll learn from the Blackfoot children, who don't care about town gossip. They'll read every book we can get our hands on." He set down his carving to take her hands. "They'll know they were wanted, loved, chosen. That's more than most children get." Margaret squeezed his fingers. "You always know what to say." "I spent 20 years alone with books. Had to learn something." He brought her hands to his lips. "Besides, who says we'll always be isolated? Times change. Towns change. Fear fades when it's not fed." "You think they'll accept us someday?" "I think someday they'll realize what they missed, knowing the bravest woman in the territory." His eyes twinkled. "Also, Henderson owes me money from our last trade. Greed trumps fear every time." She laughed, as he'd intended. "So we build our own world until the outside one is ready." "We build our own world because it's the one we want. If the outside world becomes worthy of our children, We'll consider introducing them." As autumn arrived with its blaze of colors, Margaret's body ripened with new life. The morning sickness passed, replaced by an energy that had her climbing to Eagle's Peak with Elijah to see the sunrise he'd promised to show her so long ago. They sat wrapped in a buffalo robe as the sky lightened. The valley spread below them like a map of possibility. "It's more beautiful than you described," she whispered as golden light spilled across the peaks. "Everything's more beautiful with you here to see it." She leaned into him, feeling the baby move for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings. "Oh, what is it?" Concern sharpened his voice. "Nothing bad. The baby, I felt it move." She guided his hand to the spot, though she knew it was too early for him to feel it too. "Our child, Elijah, growing and moving and alive." His hands played protectively over her belly. "Our child," he repeated with wonder. "I never dreamed I'd have this." What a family. A reason to greet each sunrise with gratitude instead of resignation. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You changed everything, Margaret, everything." They stayed until the sun was fully risen, then made their way carefully down the mountain. At the cabin, they found unexpected visitors, Standing Bear and his wife. Morning Song from the Blackfoot camp, bringing gifts of beaded moccasins and dried herbs. "For the mother-to-be," Morning Song said in careful English, pressing a bundle into Margaret's hands. "Make tea when the pains come. Help baby come easy." "Thank you." Margaret embraced the older woman, who had become a friend in recent months. "Will you be there when the time comes?" "I be there. Mountain man saved my nephew from bear trap last winter. This how we repay." She patted Margaret's rounded belly with a knowing smile. "Strong baby. Winter warrior." After they left, Margaret examined the beautiful beadwork on the moccasins, tears in her eyes. "They barely know us, but they show more kindness than people I've known all my life. They judge by actions, not stories," Elijah said, "makes them better neighbors than most." As winter approached with its familiar bite, they settled into a rhythm of preparation and peace. Evenings found them by the fire, Margaret knitting while Elijah read aloud, his voice painting pictures in the warm air. Sometimes the wolves would howl outside, and he'd pause to listen, occasionally offering his own howl in response. "What are you telling them?" she asked one night, looking up from the tiny sweater in her lap. "That all is well, that the pack grows." He smiled at her over the book. "They're pleased about the baby. Say it's about time." "Bossy wolves." "The worst. Yesterday, the gray one suggested we name it after him." Margaret laughed, her whole body shaking with it. The baby responded with a strong kick, as if joining the mirth. "Active tonight," Elijah observed, setting aside the book to kneel beside her chair. He placed both hands on her belly, marveling as always at the movement within. "Hello, little one. Ready to join us out here?" Another kick, directly under his palm. "I think that's a yes," Margaret said softly, covering his hands with hers. They stayed like that as the fire crackled and snow began to fall outside. A man and woman who had found each other through the strangest of circumstances, building a life in the wilderness, waiting for their child to complete the family that had begun with a forced marriage and grown into something beautiful. "No regrets?" Elijah asked, echoing her earlier question. Margaret thought of the life she might have had, married to some town boy, keeping house on a respectable street, living and dying within the narrow confines of others' expectations. Then she looked at her husband, wild and gentle in equal measure, at the home they'd made together, at the life growing within her. "Not one," she said firmly. "Not a single one." Outside, the wolves sang their approval to the winter moon, and inside, the mountain man and his wife prepared for the greatest adventure of all, parenthood. Far from judgment, surrounded by love. The baby came with a spring thaw, as if she'd been waiting for the world to soften before making her entrance. Margaret labored through the night with Morning Song at her side and Elijah holding her hand, his face pale but steady. When their daughter finally arrived, screaming her fury at the cold air, the wolves gathered outside the cabin began to howl, not their usual wild song, but something softer, almost like a lullaby. "A girl," Morning Song announced, placing the squirming bundle in Margaret's arms. Strong like mother, loud like mountain storm. Margaret laughed through her exhaustion, gazing down at the tiny face already scowling at the world. "Hello, little one. We've been waiting for you." Elijah touched the baby's cheek with one trembling finger, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She's perfect. Look at her. Margaret, she's absolutely perfect." "What will you name her?" Morning Song asked, cleaning up with quiet efficiency. Margaret and Elijah exchanged glances. They'd discussed names through the long winter nights, but now, seeing her— "Rose," Margaret said softly. "For my mother. Rose Elizabeth Stone." "Rose." Elijah tested the name, smiling when the baby's fist closed around his finger. "Our wild mountain rose." As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the wolves' song faded, but when Elijah went to the window, he saw them still there, the whole pack arranged in a protective circle around the cabin, the great gray at their head like a sentinel. "They're standing guard," he murmured in wonder. "Of course they are," Morning Song said matter-of-factly. "New life is sacred. Even wolves know this." In the days that followed, Margaret discovered that motherhood in the mountains came with its own unique challenges and joys. Rose was a demanding baby, quick to cry but equally quick to settle when her father walked her around the cabin, humming tunelessly. The wolves often appeared during these walks, watching through the windows with what Margaret could only describe as approval. "She's going to think it's normal, having wolves for neighbors," Margaret said one afternoon, nursing Rose while Elijah prepared dinner. "Isn't it?" He grinned at her over his shoulder. "Wait until she's old enough to ride on the gray one's back." "Elijah Stone, you will not let our daughter ride wolves like ponies." "We'll see what the wolves think about that." But there was truth in his joking. As Rose grew from squalling newborn to curious infant, the boundaries between wild and domestic seemed to blur. The wolves left gifts, choice bones, interesting feathers. Once a perfectly preserved butterfly wing that Elijah mounted in a frame for the nursery. In return, he shared his hunts with them, maintaining the ancient balance of give and take. Summer arrived in full glory, and Margaret stood at her garden gate. Rose balanced on her hip, surveying her domain. The vegetables grew tall and strong. Flowers bloomed in profusion, and the expanded cabin gleamed with fresh chinking. They'd built a good life here, she thought, a strange one, perhaps, but good. "Mama, woof." Rose pointed chubby fingers at the forest edge where a young wolf watched them curiously. "That's right, sweetheart, wolf." Margaret had given up being surprised by her daughter's lack of fear. Rose seemed to understand instinctively that these creatures were protectors, not threats. Elijah emerged from the barn, carrying fresh eggs. The sight of him still made her heart skip, this man who'd bought her freedom and given her so much more. He'd filled out some in the past year, good food and happiness softening the harsh angles that isolation had carved. "A trading party coming up the trail," he said, shading his eyes. "Looks like Henderson and— is that Doc Morrison?" Margaret's stomach tightened. They'd had no contact with Cedar Ridge since that terrible night. Why would the doctor be coming here? But when the riders arrived, Doc Morrison's first words eased her fears. "Mrs. Stone, Mr. Stone, I'm not here officially. Just wanted to, well, to apologize, and to see how you're faring." "Apologize?" Elijah's voice was carefully neutral. The elderly doctor dismounted, removing his hat. "I should have spoken up that night. Should have stopped the madness before it went so far. I've been doctoring in Cedar Ridge for 30 years, and that was the most shameful thing I've ever witnessed." "What's done is done," Margaret said quietly, adjusting Rose on her hip. "Perhaps, but I brought this." He produced a package wrapped in brown paper. "Birth certificate for the little one, already filed with the county. Official and proper, listing both parents." Margaret accepted the package with shaking hands. Such a simple thing, but it meant Rose would exist in the eyes of the law, would have rights and recognition. "Thank you," she managed. Henderson cleared his throat. "That's not all. Tom Corwin's gone. Lit out for California after his arm healed. His father disowned him after hearing what really happened. The whole town's been reconsidering things." "Reconsidering?" Elijah asked, realizing maybe we judged too quickly, that maybe the real savage was the one wearing a badge and leading mobs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "Point is, you'd be welcome in town. Both of you. All three of you." Margaret looked at Elijah, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. After a moment, she spoke. "We appreciate that, Mr. Henderson. Truly, but we have everything we need right here." "I understand." Doc Morrison settled his hat back on his head. "But if you ever need anything, supplies, medical care, anything at all, you send word. The town owes you a debt." After they left, Margaret and Elijah sat on the porch, watching Rose toddle after butterflies in the garden. The wolves had emerged from the forest, lounging in the afternoon sun like enormous dogs. "Did you mean it?" Elijah asked. "About not needing the town?" "Every word." She leaned against his shoulder. "Why would we trade this for their approval? Rose will learn her letters from you, her strength from the mountains, her courage from the wolves. What more could town offer? Friends her own age, eventually, proper schooling, a chance at a normal life." Margaret laughed. "Normal Elijah Stone. We passed normal the night you bought me for $800. We flew past it when the wolves came to our rescue. We left it so far behind I can't even see it anymore. No regrets." She looked at their daughter, who had discovered a patch of clover and was examining it with intense concentration. At the cabin they'd made into a home. At the man who'd become everything she never knew she needed. "I told you before. Not one." She turned to face him fully. "This is our happily ever after. It just happens to include wolves." As if in agreement, the gray wolf raised his massive head and howled. Rose immediately tried to imitate the sound, producing something between a yodel and a sneeze that made both parents laugh. She's going to be trouble, Elijah predicted, scooping up his daughter and tossing her gently in the air. Her delighted squeals echoed off the mountains. Like her mother. Exactly like her mother. He pulled Margaret close with his free arm. My fierce, brave, beautiful sparrow who became an eagle. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Margaret found Elijah in the nursery, placing a new carving on the shelf above Rose's crib. It was a wolf, howling at an unseen moon, exquisitely detailed and small enough to fit in a child's hand. For protection, he explained, the real ones can't always be here, but this one will watch over her always. Margaret wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. She's lucky to have you for a father, and you for a mother. He turned in her embrace, cupping her face gently. Margaret, do you remember what you said to them? That nobody wanted to be the mountain man's wife? Until I saw your gentle heart, she finished softly. I remember. You changed everything that night. Not the night you said it first, but the night you declared it to the world. The night you chose me in front of everyone. And you chose me right back, face down a mob for me. I'd do it again, face down 100 mobs. He kissed her forehead. You gave me a life I never dared dream of. A wife, a child, a family. You made me whole. We made each other whole, she corrected. That's how the best love stories work. From her crib, Rose made a contented sound in her sleep. Outside, the wolves sang their ancient songs to the stars. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and somewhere an owl called into the darkness. Margaret thought again of that long-ago night in the saloon, when her father had sold her like property, and her future had seemed like a prison sentence. How strange that what began as her worst nightmare had transformed into her greatest blessing. "Elijah," she whispered into the peaceful darkness. I want more children, brothers and sisters for Rose, a whole cabin full of little mountain warriors." She felt him smile against her hair. "I'd like that too, though we might need to build more rooms. And get more wolves," she added with a laugh. "One guardian per child seems only fair. I'll negotiate with the pack tomorrow." They stood together in the doorway, watching their daughter sleep, surrounded by love and protected by both man and nature, the mountain man and his wife, who had found in each other not what they expected, but exactly what they needed. Margaret whispered the words that had become her truth. Nobody wanted to be the mountain man's wife until she saw his gentle heart. Elijah pulled her closer, adding his own truth, and nobody thought the mountain man could love again until you did. In her crib, Rose smiled in her sleep, as if she knew she was the living proof of both statements. Love born from unlikely beginnings, thriving in the wilderness, protected by wolves and blessed by mountains. Their happily ever after was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what touched your heart in Margaret and Elijah's journey. If you enjoyed this Wild West love story, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more romantic adventures from the American frontier. Don't forget to like this video and hit that hype button to help more listeners discover this story of unexpected love in the Montana mountains.